Sally Mason lived in a modest neighborhood in Chattanooga, Tennessee, the kind where porches sagged a little under the weight of time, and mailboxes bore the faded names of families who had moved away decades ago. Her house sat at the corner of a quiet intersection, flanked by an ancient maple tree and a picket fence whose white paint had big asterisk end to peel into ribbons. It was a quiet life, one measured in coffee spoons and sunrises, small routines repeated like prayers. Years ago, Sally had been someone else entirely. A rescue diver with the U.S. Coast Guard, she was known among her peers for a calm resolve and hands that moved fast in water and even faster in chaos. She had once pulled a drowning child from under a capsized ferry in a storm off the Atlantic coast. Another time, she'd rappelled down a cliff to rescue an injured hiker, then carried him back up on her shoulders, one step at a time, sweat and grit mixing in the folds of her uniform. She had always gone where others could not. And when the call came, she answered. Without hesitation. Without glory. The accident changed everything. During a particularly violent rescue mission in Galveston Bay, a structural collapse beneath a pier hurled Sally and 3 civilians into a churning flood. She managed to shove them toward safety before being pinned under a submerged beam. The water was black. The silence underwater reminded her of childhood dreams, of falling endlessly. By the time they pulled her out, the damage had already claimed her legs. Her spine fractured in 2 places, leaving her paralyzed from the waist down. For weeks in the hospital, she had stared at the ceiling tiles and traced shapes in their dull patterning, as if trying to decipher some secret message in the repetition. Pity made her skin crawl. Gratitude made her uncomfortable. She was given medals, ceremonies, speeches. None of it could return what had been lost, not just the movement, but the freedom, the independence, the anonymity. Now every room she entered acknowledged her differently, as if the chair beneath her had altered her soul. And yet, Sally endured, not by turning bitter, but by turning outward. She refused to be defined by her limitations. Instead, she began to use her time to help others who walked, or rolled, a similar path. Every Thursday, she volunteered at the local Veterans Center, where she led support groups and organized drives for winter gear and hygiene kits. Her words, soft and unwavering, reached men and women broken by wars and silence. And every Wednesday morning, she arrived at the public library just before 10 a.m. to read to children. She brought a thermos of chamomile tea, a folded blanket for the seat beside her, and worn picture books with duct-taped corners and stories about oceans, dragons, and bravery. Sally knew her neighbors, and her neighbors knew her. She moved through the community with the grace of someone who asked for nothing but gave freely. There was a small flower bed she maintained outside the community center, even in winter. There was a homeless man named Curtis she brought sandwiches to on Sundays, always cut diagonally, with the crusts trimmed. There was a teenager, Maya, who'd lost her father in Afghanistan. Sally gave her quiet mentorship, not with advice, but with presence. She never asked for recognition. She lived her days like ripples from a stone dropped in a still pond, unseen, but spreading. But the town wasn't always kind in return. The buildings were old. The sidewalks narrow. Curbs and stairs rose like brick walls. City Hall, in particular, stood proud and inaccessible, its front entrance a stretch of stone steps and heavy double doors, designed in a time before such considerations were made. Sally had attended council meetings via video link for over a year, always greeted politely, always postponed when she raised the issue of accessibility. She never complained. She collected data, cited case studies, compiled community testimonials. And then, at last, she filed a formal proposal, a request for citywide funding to install wheelchair ramps and lifts in all municipal buildings. It wasn't about her, she explained. It was about the elderly couple who couldn't attend voting sessions. The young boy with cerebral palsy whose mother had to carry him up crumbling steps. The soldier newly returned home who couldn't access his own benefits office. The proposal had been moved up the agenda after months of delay. And so, that crisp autumn morning, she prepared herself. Her uniform, clean, pressed, the medals aligned just right, rested across her bed. She wouldn't wear it yet, but she'd bring it with her in a garment bag, in case the moment required a reminder of who she was beneath the chair. She brewed a cup of coffee, then poured it into her thermos. She checked her notes, printed from her outdated desktop computer, then slid them carefully into a binder with tab dividers. The room was quiet except for the rhythmic clicking of her wheelchair's brakes and the occasional creak of floorboards. The morning light filtered through the curtains in pale strips, like sunlight through water. She caught a glimpse of herself in the hallway mirror. Her eyes still held the sea in them, even if her legs no longer did. She called a cab. Her usual driver, Dan, wasn't available. The dispatcher said someone else would come in his place. She didn't think much of it. Just a ride to City Hall. A small errand in a larger campaign for dignity. And so she waited at the edge of the driveway, binder in her lap, thermos tucked under her arm, the garment bag folded across the chair's back. The maple leaves fell gently around her, gold and rust-colored, catching in her hair and in the wheels. She didn't know yet what kind of day it would be. She didn't know that pain often arrived without warning. And neither did she know that honor sometimes followed behind, quietly, like a shadow waiting for its light. The taxi arrived 17 minutes late. Sally saw it before she heard it, an older sedan with peeling decals and a crooked rooftop sign, wobbling slightly as it turned onto her street. The driver didn't get out. He idled at the curb, checking his phone, one hand tapping impatiently against the steering wheel. It was a small discourtesy, but one that weighed heavier than it should have. Sally wheeled herself down the sloped edge of the driveway. Her fingers pushed against the rims in practiced motion, her breath even. She had made this journey hundreds of times. But there was a difference between movement by necessity and movement made difficult by someone else's indifference. When she reached the side of the taxi, she looked up through the passenger window. The man inside was in his 40s, maybe early 50s, with a thin mustache and tired eyes that narrowed slightly as they met hers. He didn't move. She tapped gently on the window, raising her voice just enough. He rolled it down with a mechanical buzz. "You gonna need help getting that thing in?" he asked, nodding toward her chair, not quite meeting her gaze. "I've got it, thank you," she replied evenly. With effort, she transferred herself from chair to seat, locking her wheels before folding the chair and maneuvering it into the back seat space beside her. The man watched, arms crossed. He made no move to assist. Once inside, Sally took a breath and gave the address. The driver grunted. As the taxi rolled forward, the air inside seemed to grow smaller. The ride was less than 10 minutes, but it felt longer. The driver turned the radio on loud, old rock stations with static-ridden guitars and commercial breaks that shouted about payday loans and car insurance. He took 2 personal calls during the ride, holding the phone in one hand while steering with the other. His voice rose and fell in curt sentences, laced with irritation and profanity. At one point, he cursed about traffic, though there was none. At another, he muttered something under his breath, just loud enough for her to hear. People like this shouldn't even be out here, messing up everyone's day. She said nothing. Her gaze stayed on the buildings outside. One hand clutched her binder. The other pressed her thermos against her ribs like a shield. The chair beside her bumped gently against the door with every turn, a quiet metronome of discomfort. He didn't pull up to the front of City Hall. He stopped halfway along the curb and popped the trunk. "We're here," he said, not looking at her. Sally opened the door slowly and maneuvered her body to the edge of the seat. Her arms strained against gravity, the strain of pulling herself downward onto cold pavement as she reached for her folded chair. The sidewalk was uneven. Her fingers fumbled with the latch. Still, he didn't move. A woman walking her dog on the opposite side of the street paused to watch. A couple stood nearby waiting for a bus. Nobody offered help. Not out of cruelty, but that brand of hesitancy that comes when people don't know whether assistance is welcome or insulting. As she unfolded the chair and transferred herself back into it, the driver revved the engine slightly. Then he pulled away before the door was fully closed. The rear tire clipped the edge of her chair, not enough to injure, but enough to jolt. The motion sent her thermos toppling to the ground. Its lid popped off, spilling tea onto the sidewalk in a spreading amber puddle. Sally froze. The binder in her lap had shifted, and her printed notes fluttered loose along the sidewalk. One page caught the wind and began to tumble toward the gutter. The woman with the dog walked faster. The couple at the bus stop looked away. Sally steadied her breath and began gathering the pages. Her fingers moved deliberately, one sheet at a time, smoothing each one across her lap. At the top of the steps to City Hall, a group of municipal employees stood in small circles sipping coffee and glancing occasionally in her direction. None of them moved. She wheeled herself toward the entrance, her wheels tracing wet lines through the spilled tea. The garment bag shifted against the backrest behind her, brushing the ground once as she ascended the makeshift metal ramp at the side entrance, a ramp she had fought 6 months to have temporarily installed. The council chambers were already half full when she arrived. Suits and ties. Nameplates on tables. A screen overhead that flickered between agenda items and decorative logos. Her name appeared under Community Recommendations, third on the list. She found her seat near the rear. No one had left space for a wheelchair closer to the front. She sat alone, her binder resting on her lap, her thermos now empty beside it. The room murmured around her. Some eyes recognized her, others did not. A man 2 rows ahead whispered to his colleague and nodded in her direction. Someone behind her sighed loudly, muttering something about another speaker asking for special treatment. She didn't react. She didn't cry. She didn't leave. She sat, spine straight, shoulders squared, her breath shallow but measured. The tea stain on her sleeve had already begged in to dry. Her hands, trembling slightly, clutched the binder like it held not paper, but proof. Proof that she belonged here. That her words mattered. The room grew warmer as more bodies filled it. Laughter erupted from the far corner where junior staff gathered around a laptop. Someone spilled a coffee. Someone else took a selfie. The atmosphere felt more like a waiting room than a council hall. And in the center of it, she waited. Outside, the taxi driver turned another corner and drove on, already forgetting the morning. But someone else hadn't. Because across the street, beneath the shade of the courthouse tree, someone had been watching the entire time. Exactly 1 hour later, the same taxi driver received a new fare request. The address came through his dispatch app as a standard pickup, Veterans Community Hall, 8th and Parker. He rolled his eyes. Another charity event, probably. He was already behind on his shift quota. Still, it was a quiet corner of town, maybe an easy ride, quick in and out. When he pulled up, the curb was packed. People lined the sidewalk, many in uniform. Flags flanked the building's entrance. A few journalists milled around, cameras at their sides, not yet recording but clearly ready. The driver leaned on his horn once. No response. Then the doors of the building opened, and 3 uniformed Marines stepped outside. They walked toward him with silent purpose. No words, no nods. Just the weight of command in every footstep. One of them knocked gently on his window. The driver hesitated, unsure. "We need you to come inside," the Marine said, voice low, flat. Not a threat, just a fact. The driver started to protest but stopped himself. Something in the Marine's tone made argument feel irrelevant. So he parked and followed them through the doors. Inside, the room was full. City council members, veterans in full dress, families with children seated quietly, a few reporters positioned along the edges. The chatter from earlier had dissolved. What remained was a focused silence, like the space between breaths. At the front of the hall, in full uniform, sat Sally Mason. She was no longer just a woman in a chair. Now, she was a figure of stillness and poise, her chest adorned with medals, her shoulders square, her gaze steady. The silver star sat among them, glinting under the overhead lights. Next to her stood the mayor, his hand resting gently on a podium, papers neatly arranged in front of him. The driver's footsteps echoed as he entered. Heads turned. Conversation stilled. He wasn't given a seat. He was simply left standing, visible to everyone, uncomfortably alone. Then the mayor cleared his throat. "This morning," he began, "one of our own endured something no citizen, especially not a veteran, should ever face in this town." He paused. Behind him, an enlarged photograph appeared on a projection screen. It was Sally in uniform, from a rescue operation nearly 20 years earlier. She was younger, soaked, holding a small child in her arms. Another image followed, her Coast Guard unit posing in front of a helicopter, smiling, their boots muddy from the field. She gave 20 years of service to this country. She saved lives during disasters most of us only read about. And yet today, she was treated not as a hero, but as an inconvenience. Murmurs rose briefly among the crowd. A few nodded. Some frowned. A third image appeared, security footage from outside City Hall, zoomed in on the taxi door slamming, the wheelchair nearly clipped, the tea spilled across the sidewalk. The driver's face drained of color. Sally had not spoken yet. She didn't need to. Her silence filled the room more than any speech could have. Her hands rested lightly in her lap, fingers brushing the corner of her binder. A decorated general stepped forward then. His ribbons glittered like distant stars. He saluted her, slowly. Then turned to the audience. "I served in Afghanistan," he said. "I know what it means to depend on someone in the worst moment of your life." Sally Mason pulled a father of 3 out of a sinking ferry during a Category 4 storm. He was unconscious when they found him. "He was my cousin. He wouldn't be alive if not for her." He paused. "What happened to her this morning isn't just disrespectful, it's dangerous. It sends a message that service means nothing. That sacrifice is disposable." He held up a small velvet box and opened it. Inside was a challenge coin, engraved with the emblem of the 8th Maritime Rescue Battalion. It gleamed as he placed it gently into Sally's hand. A standing ovation followed. All at once, the room rose. Officers. Officials. Civilians. The applause was steady, not loud, but resolute, like rainfall that does not stop. The sound filled the space, pushing back the silence that had earlier surrounded her outside that taxi. And in the back of the room, the driver stood still, eyes darting, unsure whether to leave or remain. No one spoke to him. No one acknowledged him. He was present, but invisible. The mayor motioned toward the city council seated in the front row. "Effective immediately," he announced, "we are expanding our accessibility grant. We'll be reviewing all city infrastructure for compliance and inclusion. And all contracted drivers for city services will be required to complete dignity and disability training within 30 days. A few reporters began scribbling. Camera flashes flickered like distant lightning. Only now did Sally speak. Her voice was calm, barely raised above a whisper, but the microphone carried it. "I don't want punishment," she said. "I want better. For the next person in a chair. For the next child with braces on their legs. For the veteran who doesn't have medals to make people listen. Let's not fix it because someone important was hurt. Let's fix it because it's right." Another ripple of applause. But not for performance, for conviction. The 3 Marines returned to her side as the mayor offered a formal proclamation of gratitude, presenting her with a plaque bearing her name and service record. Her photograph would be added to the city's wall of honor. The veterans in the back saluted her in unison. The taxi driver quietly turned and left before the ceremony ended. No one stopped him. No one needed to. Outside, the sunlight had shifted. It fell softer now through the trees, as if the sky itself had been listening. And from a second-story window across the street, a young woman watching from behind a curtain turned away and sat down at her desk. She opened a fresh notebook, wrote the words "Today I saw what honor looks like," and circled it twice. By that evening, the story had begun to spread. A local reporter posted a brief video clip, just 17 seconds long, showing the applause in the Veterans Hall and the moment the challenge coin was placed in Sally's hand. Within hours, it had been shared across state forums, disability advocacy groups, and veteran networks. A national journalist retweeted it with the caption, "Her silence said more than any speech." That line became a hashtag. The next morning, City Hall's voicemail was full before 9 a.m. Messages poured in from around the country. Veterans from Oregon to Florida called to thank her. A woman in Nebraska wrote to say her teenage son, born with spina bifida, had watched the video 5 times and asked to visit City Hall in his own town, just like the woman with the medals. A retired schoolteacher from Wisconsin sent an old Coast Guard patch she'd kept since her brother's service, now enclosed in an envelope marked "For Sally, with respect." The taxi company issued a public apology. The driver, identified only by first name, was dismissed before noon. The company's spokesperson stood beside the mayor during a press briefing and confirmed that all drivers would undergo mandatory disability training. But they also did more. They donated 6 brand new accessible vans to local nonprofits, each labeled in honor of Sally Mason. Within a week, the city council reconvened. What had once been a quiet corner of the meeting agenda became headline discussion. Sally's original proposal passed unanimously. Not just wheelchair ramps, but full accessibility audits, updated restrooms, emergency evacuation training, and even sensory-friendly spaces for veterans with PTSD. For the first time in decades, real infrastructure change wasn't being delayed, debated, or buried. It was being built. At the public library where Sally read to children, a small mechanical lift was installed at the front entrance, an overdue change the staff had lobbied for but never prioritized. When Sally returned the following Wednesday, she found the children waiting in a circle of beanbag chairs, holding handmade "Thank You Miss Sally" signs. One child, a quiet girl named Ava, handed her a bracelet she'd made with red, white, and blue beads. "This is so you don't forget you're our hero," she said shyly. Sally wore it on her wrist for the rest of the day. It clacked gently against the frame of her chair as she turned the pages of that week's book. At the Veterans Center, her regular corner seat had changed, too. A plaque had been mounted behind it, simple and engraved in brass, in gratitude to Petty Officer Sally Mason, rescuer, advocate, teacher, friend. The chair beside hers, once usually empty, now rarely sat vacant. Veterans who had once kept to themselves began showing up early, eager to hear her speak. Young volunteers sat beside her to learn about legislation, strategy, and kindness without compromise. One evening, as the sun set behind the old brick walls of the community hall, a small ceremony took place. It was unannounced, informal. No cameras, no officials, just a gathering of veterans, neighbors, and children. A local scout group had planted a tree in her name near the center's entrance. The mayor showed up quietly and placed a folded flag at its base. A woman from the Department of Veterans Affairs presented Sally with a letter, one written by the regional director, formally recognizing her contributions not just in service, but in advocacy. She read it alone later that night, beneath a reading lamp in her small living room. The letter was short. It closed with one sentence. "You remind us that the fight for dignity never ends, and that sometimes, the bravest rescue is simply showing up." She folded it gently and tucked it into the same binder she had taken to City Hall. People changed. Not all, but enough. A man who had once grumbled at the cost of ramps stood up at the next meeting and offered to donate supplies from his construction firm. A young mother posted on social media that her disabled son had finally attended his first council session because Sally had made space for him. A high school civics teacher used her story as a lesson, not in tragedy, but in resilience. She called it "The Day Our Town Stood Still," and then moved forward. The city's annual Veterans Day parade was approaching. For the first time, Sally was asked to serve as Grand Marshal. At first, she hesitated. It wasn't her style. But then she thought of the taxi ride, the silence, the spilled tea, and how it had turned into action, not because she demanded it, but because she endured it with dignity. On the day of the parade, she wore her uniform again. The same medals on her chest. The same quiet pride in her eyes. Her chair rolled slowly down Main Street as crowds stood on both sides, applauding not with noise, but with reverence. Among them stood the driver. Not in uniform. Not with words. Just there. Watching. His hands stayed in his pockets, his shoulders slightly hunched. But he didn't look away. Not this time. Somewhere down the line, a little girl pointed at Sally and asked, "Mommy, is she a soldier?" Her mother smiled. "She still is." And Sally, hearing this, allowed herself the smallest of smiles in return.